Welcome to Analytics Nexus. Thanks for joining us for Sarah DeAtley's presentation, Is Multi-Touch Attribution Overrated? Sarah DeAtley is a customer experience analytics expert that has been driving strategies for major corporations for over 10 years. She's currently focused on company-wide attribution modeling at Microsoft. Previously, she's worked on analytics and optimization at Expedia, Apollo Education Group, Dell, and ADP. Sarah's educational background is in user research methods, information science, database design, and advanced statistical methods, which she combines to find creative and scalable analytic solutions. She formerly taught statistical analysis and visualization at the University of Washington.
Hi, my name is Sarah DeAtley, and I'm going to be talking to you about a question that's been pretty popular recently for me, which is multi-touch attribution dead? To give you a little background on myself and kind of why I'm talking about this, so I've been in the analytics industry for over 10 years and mostly on the marketing side across Expedia, Dell, Microsoft, also worked in higher education and automotive. And multi-touch attribution has come up a lot over the years where I've either been involved in killing off people's models, in building my own, or helping provide data for other people's models. So it's something that I've dealt with a lot. And at Microsoft, my current role is entirely focused on attribution, where I'm leading a team where our responsibilities are to standardize attribution modeling, make sure there's no crazy or biased rules going on, and also to explore different multi-touch attribution methods. So I thought I would start with just giving a quick overview to make sure that we all level set around what I mean when I say multi-touch attribution. I think what a lot of people think of multi-touch attribution as, and I'll be referring to it interchangeably as multi-touch attribution, or MTA, just to save my voice. But essentially, a lot of people think of it as it's the hardcore data science models that require a lot of investigation and time. Really, multi-touch attribution is anytime it's not single touch. So a lot of times the example is when you're taking an outcome like a conversion and you're looking historically to see all the different marketing touch points that led to that outcome, single touch would be I'm giving 100% of credit to the last touch or the first touch, something like that. Multi-touch is any time that you're splitting credit between multiple touch points. So at the complex end, you can get algorithmic models that are usually more machine learning oriented and involve data scientists. But really, there are simpler heuristic multi-touch models as well. Heuristic just means rule-based. And that's where you could just have your own custom rules that decide what credit things should get. It could be linear, where you're splitting credit evenly, or it could be some other version of fractional. So when I was thinking about how to answer the question of why is everyone asking if multi-touch attribution is dead, something I heard at a conference a couple of months ago was that the first time people started talking about multi-touch was in 2007 when Bill Gates was speaking at a brand summit conference for MSN, which was both surprising and depressing to me as a Microsoft employee because I had no idea that he had any relationship to attribution. And here we are all these years later, still trying to figure out how can we approach this problem, what kind of solutions can we come up with. So his original logic was that it doesn't make logical sense to give 100% credit to one touch point when there's been hundreds or thousands that have all led to a single outcome. And since then, there's been numerous consultancies, third-party tools, different advertising platforms, all have variations on multi-touch in some way to try to answer this question, and no one's really solved it 100% of the time. And I think part of the reason why there's a lot of jaded feelings around MTA, and I'm guilty of this as well, is because of what people have run into with various projects where they're working with a third party or even in-house trying to do MTA, that there can be a big gap between the initial expectation versus the reality. In terms of what people are hoping for initially, a lot of times it's MTA is going to help us understand exactly what works and what doesn't work, which is maybe doesn't sound too aspirational, but when you are trying to do this across a very complex business or a very long time period, it does end up becoming complex. And I pulled from a bunch of different third party vendors and other websites where people had attribution solutions, and all of them mentioned some of these things, even if you maybe should have a good deal of skepticism when thinking about them. So one of the things people will say is that multi-touch can tell you not just what works and what doesn't work, but it can also tell you why it worked and why it didn't work, which is a pretty difficult question to answer. I haven't seen it with multi-touch, maybe other people have. Additionally, you might hear people say that multi-touch will automatically tell you, here's the incremental value when we're talking about paid media or something like that. People always want to know what's the incremental value versus what would have happened organically. That's another promise coming from MTA. Related to that is this feeling that you'll just have inherent growth in your ROI or your ROAS coming out of MTA. Similarly, just by virtue of looking at the customer journey, that there will be these really obvious insights, and you'll just know here's the things that people like in our journey versus don't like. And I think some companies do tend to frame it as a thing you can automate pretty easily, that once you've come up with a model of some type, then you just implement it in whatever automation platforms that you're using. And then again, you just get back to increasing ROI automatically. And closer to what I think Bill Gates was referring to is this thought that maybe it doesn't make logical sense that last touch would really be the most accurate or a single touch method, and that to be more accurate, you do need to account for a greater variety of interactions and marketing channels. So what I've found in terms of the reality is 9 times out of 10, when I talk to people who have attempted multi-touch attribution, is that they tried it and then they ultimately went back to last touch at some point. There are a variety of reasons why that might happen. Most frequently, I've seen MTA fail not because of any methodology, but because there failed to be consensus or high enough level of buy-in. So one of the things inherent with MTA is that it's not uncommon for people to say, well, we wanted to answer a lot of these questions we had on the prior slide in terms of causality, incrementality, ROI, what's the ideal customer journey, et cetera. And what you might find is that to answer many of these questions at the same time requires a more complex modeling approach, which leads to something that's very black box. And so all you might see is just the output in terms of a credit amount, but you will have no way to back into here's why the amount was exactly this much. Here's the things that caused it to go up or down. So that can be difficult for people to interpret versus a single touch method. It's also pretty easy to get non-intuitive results from MTA. One of the things I've seen here is that the first time people had attempted algorithmic MTA modeling on our team. It was a group of data scientists who didn't have a ton of marketing background. And so they ran the models and found that the number one predictor of conversion was PayPal. And I said, there's no way that could be correct. And it turned out it was because of redirects. When people were choosing PayPal as their payment method, it looked like everyone converts almost 100% of the time when they use PayPal. So the model said, oh, we'll give PayPal all the credit for this. So it's just another risk in having an MTA model and just assuming the modeling approach is going to get you results that make sense. Another thing I've seen is that MTA can be too high level. So certain teams might say, well, we optimize at this very specific dimension that only applies to our team, versus other teams might be at a much higher level of granularity. And it's hard to meet in the middle. And when you choose sort of where you're indexing toward, higher or lower granularity, that can impact if people can actually use the output or not. And to actually get to any of this output ends up being pretty resource intensive, whether that's the cost in hiring a third party or hiring data scientists, or even just from an implementation perspective. We spent years at Microsoft just building data sets that would be at a level of granularity that could be used to look at individual events tied to a visitor in a consistent way. It's just something that you have to anticipate, is that MTA is not going to be a one-time cost and then you're done and it's, again, infinite ROI forever. So it's just something that a lot of people get turned off by, where they see that this is way more expensive than we thought it was going to be, and we're not sure what the return on investment is. Related to that, I've seen sometimes the MTA results are just not that different from last touch, whether that's because you've been optimizing toward last touch all this time, so the MTA results will reflect some of that, or that you're applying MTA to channels that make sense to your business, but users don't actually interact with them very much. I've heard people say, well, this isn't that different from last touch, so why would we use it? So all these things combined end up meaning that people are typically disappointed with MTA. But I think there's some ways that you can sort of anticipate those things and still decide if there's value that you can gain. There are some things that are inherently challenging with MTA. It's not always a case of over-promising, under-delivering. I think being aware of those challenges helps you be more informed in those conversations. So one of the biggest challenges is just customer journey analysis in and of itself. It's hard to tie a lot of these things together. Some things cannot really be tied together at all. And so understanding which are the channels that you do want to divide credit between and can you connect them should be one of your earliest sort of go, no-go decisions, because if you can't really tie a lot of your channels directly together, then you might say, well, let's start with media mix modeling or something where we're not dependent on that to gain some kind of insight. I've also seen people think that customer journey analysis will just tell us, well, here's the top 5 paths we should put everyone on and everything else we can cut out. That's not a natural output of MTA, and it really relies on you to have that distribution in your data where really we tend to see thousands and thousands of paths. There's a lot of different permutations. It's difficult to use MTA. There would be other models you could use to get to some of those insights. And finally, I've just seen customer journey analysis can be difficult when you're not really clear about what your channels are trying to achieve and making sure that they're achieving it in a distinct way from each other. So a lot of channels can end up looking really similar to each other because they're just functions of different teams that you have that all signed up to drive something versus users interacting with them in a really different way. So another thing that I think everyone's dealing with in analytics is just how the changing privacy landscape is impacting the ability to do MTA. And there are a lot of companies that feel they can't even attempt it because their a lot of their data is held behind walls by third parties, or they no longer have the ability to tie together IDs that they used to in the past. So you need to understand, as a result of GDPR and CCPA, um, where are you going to have those limitations? Does that mean that you could only do MTA in certain geographies, or you would have to impute data? But something that we try to be really rigorous about at Microsoft is, even if we can tie all the data together, where we do have the luxury there of, there's a lot of data that we own that we can tie together, but should we be tying it together? Are we using it in a way that will help the customer? And can we prove that, versus just tying it together, hoping that we'll just naturally gain insights from it? So the third challenge, I would say, really comes from the analysis techniques. And this is, as I was alluding to before, really you can do something very simple for MTA, where it's just dividing credit equally, or you can do something very complex. And so the more questions you're trying to answer with a single model, the more complex that model may end up becoming. And that's where you need to be really clear on, I could put in all these different levels of granularity. I could answer this question for every segment that I have and every product and every outcome. But realistically, do you have the ability to execute on that level of granularity? Um, is this something that is more just an interesting question to answer and not something you act upon? So if it is something where you know that you tend to actually make bigger marketing decisions monthly or quarterly or annually, that should kind of dictate where MTA can or can't benefit you. MTA can be refreshed more quickly, but are you able to act on those? So I'll talk a little bit about what we've been dealing with at Microsoft, though technically I guess our journey started in 2007, but for me it's been more recent. We really started the journey several years ago, and that's where we learned that we didn't even have the underlying data in place, and the underlying consolidation of different accounts and breaking down of silos so that we could look at data in a consistent way across teams and over time. So all of that work had been going on for many years. And once some data sets were in place to be able to evaluate different attribution models in a better way, uh, the question started shifting to, okay, well, now we can see exactly how much we're over counting in certain cases. So one common scenario was that you would have several different teams all taking credit for the same purchase. So team one would be just looking at the ads that they were running and saying, well, if our ad was interacted with up to 30 days before the purchase, we should get 100% credit for that. Another team would say, well, if someone interacted with our call to actions 15 days before the purchase, we think that influenced if the purchase ultimately happened or not. We should get 100% credit. We would have yet another team that said, well, these are all looking too far back in time. We know, because it was the converting session, that when people land on our pages for the converting session, we drove 100% of that purchase. And then yet another team who said, we feel similarly, but actually, if you landed on our pages for that converting session, we drove that purchase. They didn't drive it. And finance ultimately said, these all add up to way over 100%. Can you help us get to something that makes sense and adds up to 100%? So we think about it in terms of a maturity framework, but I think it's a little maturity curve is not the right word. We're not trying to get every single team to an MTA model because it doesn't make sense in every case. It can be resource intensive, and we're not built to scale that way currently. Um, so what a lot of teams have is essentially a last touch method, which is pretty common, I would say. There are also other teams who have created their own MTA model that's heuristic or rule based, where they're basically using just previous analysis or experiment results to infer here's how much credit we should split between multiple touch points. What we would then do is if there's a team who seems like they might be a good candidate for MTA, where we are able to tie together lots of different events, we then start to do baseline analysis to see, is this going to be overkill or not? So this ends up being pretty important. We start out with a heuristic MTA model, whether it's linear, dividing credit equally, or participation, where everything gets 100% credit. We do this to see just what's the natural customer behavior today between converters and non-converters. Are there any inherent differences in how they touch different channels or not? So one of the things we'll look at is just how long are their paths total versus how different are these paths? How diverse are they? And that helps us start to answer the question of, is multi-touch going to add any value versus single touch? Because if what we had seen is that most people actually just touch one, maybe two channels, they all do it within a day, and then they never come back, we might say multi-touch isn't really going to add much value here, just stick with single touch. We also try to look at what percentage of people had a multi-touch path or not. So that way we can start to tell basically where can multi-touch play a part here, and then what does that natural distribution of channels look like between converters and non-converters. Another benefit of doing this is we can start to get closer to a maximum credit. So with the single touch, it's close to the minimum a channel might get depending on the channel. With something like participation, you can see here's the maximum credit this channel could get. So that gives us a range too to see which channels would stand to benefit the most from multi-touch. So based on all of that, we're still in the process of exploring, but then we get to this question of knowing what we know about the inherent sort of challenges in using MTA and how people are constantly disappointed by it. Is it really dead or alive? And this is where I would say it's dead in terms of people definitely go into it without rosy colored glasses anymore. People tend to be more skeptical, which I think is a good thing. It's no different from any other analysis solution, where you shouldn't just think of it as a magical silver bullet that's going to solve every single problem you have in your marketing portfolio. But we do try to think about where could it help, even if it's something simpler, because you ideally want to aim for models that are fair, that's not going to be biasing one channel over others just because. We want to use models that are data driven versus just our CEO's favorite channel or something. And then this is the part that's probably trickiest, which is the interpretability. You ideally want a model that people understand how it works and they believe in the logic behind it. So this is where it's more of an art than a science, I would say. So you don't necessarily need to say any type of MTA model is not going to work for me. If you have evaluated what you have today and you feel like you might benefit from it, think in advance about these trade-offs that you're making. The more interpretable a model is, the less complex it is, but you're potentially gaining accuracy as you get more complex. And so you have to think about, basically, have we been operating off of last touch for a long time and we no longer feel that we're able to optimize further? Those types of things will help you decide, is it time to sort of move along the road to MTA and evaluate some of these other models? So we use a cheat sheet internally, and I think these kind of visuals are pretty common now to explain different attribution models. But one of the things that we tried to stay true to was this idea that something like MTA would only make sense if it met certain requirements, whether in some cases it was a case that we were dealing with a much longer buying cycle and we already had a strong forecast in place. We wanted to compare to something like time decay. In other cases, like the one we were just going over, they did tend to be longer paths. There was a high channel diversity. We could tie a lot of things together. And so then we could talk about evaluating MMM or MTA, something like that. So finally, I thought this cartoon pretty much represented my feelings on this, that apocalyptic marketing predictions come up frequently, and it's a good way to start a conversation around it in terms of, is retail dead? Is brand loyalty dead? Is attribution dead? So I think, as I mentioned, it's not dead, but it's certainly gotten harder. And I think what also hasn't died is this need to understand the roles different channels play, the relationship they have to each other, and to compare and contrast single touch versus multi-touch, even if it's not just assuming that an algorithmic black box model will solve all your problems. I think there's still a lot of benefit in exploring MTA and learning about whether or not it makes sense for your business. So that is everything that I have for you today. Thank you for taking the time to listen. Have a great day.
Thanks so much for watching this presentation. Join us on the Analytics Nexus Slack to talk with our presenters about this topic and more.